Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. While the Western conceptions of the Indo-Pacific may be more focused on the Sino-American rivalry in the East and the South China Sea for India and its vision for the Indo-Pacific, the security of the Western Indian Ocean remains equally important. The Western Indian Ocean is essential to India's energy security and it is an important trade and commerce route. As a big country perched at the heart of the Indian Ocean region, facts of geography alone ensure that India cannot afford to ignore the geopolitical developments in it. For China too, port development at Gwadar and the CPEC are about gaining direct access to the Western Indian Ocean and addressing its so-called Malacca dilemma. It is also revealing that in 2016 China acquired its first overseas military base in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. To understand the geopolitics of the Western Indian Ocean, take stock of the strategic developments in the region and discuss India's role, challenges, opportunities and avenues for cooperation with its partners, I have with me Dr. Rahul Roy-Chaudhury. Dr. Rahul Roy-Chaudhury is a senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, London, where he leads the Institute's South Asia Research Program. He is the author of Sea Power and Indian Security and India's Maritime Security. Welcome to the National Security Conversation, Dr. Roy-Chaudhury.
Thank you, Dr. Happymon Jacob. I have long admired your video interviews, and so I'm delighted to be here today. I think your video interviews have had tremendous substantive content and policy relevance, so thank you.
Thank you. Rahul, you have done a lot of work on the Indian Ocean and the Indian Navy. If you could sort of tell our viewers what is the role of the Indian Ocean in the Indian strategic imagination, the Indian Ocean in general and the Western Indian Ocean in particular in the Indian sort of strategic imagination, as it were?
Sure. There's been a huge transformation of Indian thinking towards the Indian Ocean in the last 20-25 years. When I wrote my first two books in 1995 and 2000, the Indian Ocean was not an area of great priority or strategic interest for India. But in the last few years, that has dramatically changed. And I think we're looking at a change that has taken place for three major reasons. One is a greater understanding of the economic and energy dependence from overseas based on the sea lanes of communication. The second reason I think has really been in terms of the China factor and China's growing influence in the Indian Ocean. And thirdly was really the perpetrators of the Mumbai terrorist attack in 2008 who came by sea. And these three factors have led to an awakening, I think, of India's thinking towards the Indian Ocean. This took place with the Manmohan Singh government also, which talked about India being a net security provider for the island states of the Indian Ocean. But it was galvanized by Prime Minister Modi when he took over in 2014, when for the first time he identified the Indian Ocean as part of India's immediate and extended neighborhood, thereby giving it a priority in terms of India's neighborhood first foreign policy. That was the key difference. Before, the Indian Ocean was never seen as part of India's neighborhood in that sense. But that changed dramatically. And of course, we have the March 2015 Indian Ocean speech by the Prime Minister in Mauritius talking about security and growth for all in the region. And then the greater focus on maritime domain awareness and a focus again on being a provider of net security. So there's been a dramatic transformation, and it is a transformation that has taken some time, but I think India now is in a far better position to appreciate, understand and arguably lead on Indian Ocean security.
So you then say that for a long time there was this criticism in India that India has what is called sea blindness. There is no cohesive, proper thinking about utilizing the sort of maritime space in order to articulate India's interest in the region. You are saying that is changing in a fundamental way.
That is changing. I mean, I was privileged to join the Indian government in 2000
Right.
to look at maritime security in that sense. And one of the key concerns, of course, was that when you look at maritime affairs, it is not one single ministry or department or agency that looks at it. There are 20 ministries, department, agencies, the Navy, the Coast Guard. There are 9 coastal states, 4 union territories. And the concern was that there was no sort of coherent or coordinated approach towards maritime security. That now has changed. It's taken a long time, but we do have since February or since the end of January this year, we do have the appointment of a National Maritime Security Coordinator, and we hope we get to the next stage, that is the formation of a National Maritime Commission, which I had actually written about over 20 years ago in my second book, and recommended the formation of a National Maritime Commission.
Rahul, if you actually look at the Indian strategic space, as it were, you are actually looking at the contested, let's say, a harsh continental space and a little more relaxed, I would say, the maritime space. Now, I'm not saying there is a contradiction between the two. Some people have argued, in fact, people including Admiral Raja Menon have made this argument that some of the difficulties that India is facing in the continental space can actually be eased by properly and cleverly utilizing the maritime space. And he's, of course, talking about China on the line of actual control. So do you think the maritime space or the whole talk about Indo-Pacific, etc., is an opportunity for India to tackle some of the continental challenges that it is facing today?
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, I think India has tremendous potential, prospects and leverage in terms of its role, its influence within the Indian Ocean. I mean, at the moment it seeks to be a leading power in the Indian Ocean. But I would also, there are concerns, so there are caveats on this. And the 2 or 3 caveats, I think, firstly, are that notwithstanding the rhetoric that we've seen from the previous governments and the current government, the situation on the ground in terms of naval hardware remains of concern. So the Navy has been given a higher profile. It is more active. It is sort of operational deployments are much more and faster than before. But in terms of hardware, we still really haven't seen a great increase. Look at the situation of submarines. Today, India has 16 submarines, and I call this the sort of 3 quarters and 1 quarter dilemma. 3 quarters of India's submarines are over 20 years of age. So out of the 16 submarines, 9 submarines are about 30 years of age, and 4 are over 20 years, between 20 to 30 years of age. That means 3 quarters of submarines are over 20 years of age. Take this factor and sort of place it with the 1 quarter dilemma, which is that in 1999 there was a 30-year submarine plan which has been sort of implemented in various stages. The idea was that there would be 24 new submarines by 2030 in the next few years, the 30-year plan. We are going to have a quarter of the submarines that were planned. We are only going to have 6 new submarines instead of 24 new submarines. So this is what I call the 3/4 dilemma for the submarine force, which essentially means that the submarine force in India will increase slightly with the 2 new acquisitions and commissioning of the Calvary class, and then in the next few years will again start decreasing because there is no follow-on production. There has been no decision to follow on capability, to provide the follow-on capabilities of submarines. And that is the worry, not only in the conventional class of submarines of diesel electric, but also nuclear powered submarines. And so we have really a dilemma, the 3/4 dilemma for submarines for the Indian Navy.
That doesn't sound good at all. But I want to sort of, take this conversation forward along a slightly different line. When you look at the Indian Ocean region, there is the Eastern Indian Ocean, there is the Southern Indian Ocean, there is the Western Indian Ocean. How do you sort of propose how India should look at these 3 sort of regions, as it were, in terms of its own security considerations? And my own feeling is that there is very little focus on the Western Indian Ocean, or am I completely wrong on that?
No, I think you're right, but I would sort of look at it slightly differently. I mean, I would look at it as the Western Indo-Pacific and the Eastern Indo-Pacific, because for 2 reasons. One, there is a link between the Western Indo-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific regions, and I think that's an important link. But secondly, that the interaction, the interface within these two regions is also different. So you would need different measures, different responses to the different conditions operating in the two parts of the Indo-Pacific. For example, in the Eastern Indo-Pacific, clearly there are issues of disputed territory, Chinese assertiveness, there's sort of a more sort of active role of players like Japan and Australia and the US. In the Western Indo-Pacific, the relationships are quite different. Distance is one key factor. So there are no, it's difficult for the Chinese to maintain a permanent presence in the Western Indo-Pacific in the absence of any base facilities, which is the case at the moment. I mean, they do have an overseas supply facility in Djibouti, but it's still very limited. There are no disputes, or there are no sort of assertive Chinese assertive policies in the Indian Ocean because of the limited capacity that they do have. So for these reasons, the Indian approach, I think, has to be different, where on the Western Indo-Pacific, India needs to take a leading role to be proactive, to coordinate and deepen security, maritime relations with the littoral states of the Western Indo-Pacific, including the Gulf region, Eastern Africa, and the Arabian Sea. And also, I would argue the Bay of Bengal. But for the Eastern Indo-Pacific, I think its objective should be different, where it will not be the player. It may have a presence, it may carry out operations or exercises, but it's not going to be the player that it could be in the West Indo-Pacific. So I think in order to leverage India's strengths in terms of the continental challenge that you've talked about, we have to be very clear that India's strength lies in the Western Indo-Pacific, not in the Eastern Indo-Pacific.
That is very well put. You know, if you actually look at the security architecture in the region, say when you compare that with the Eastern Indo-Pacific, as you put it, with the Western Indo-Pacific, for all the talk about Indo-Pacific, you know, the confluence of two oceanic spaces, etc., much of the security architecture actually exists in the Eastern Indian Ocean, be it Quad or AUKUS or, you know, the Japanese, the Australians, even the Americans for that matter. They are sort of moving away from the West Asian region to, or Middle Eastern region to the Eastern Indian Ocean sort of region. I mean, so therefore, there is a certain contradiction here. There is a tension between these two spaces, as it were. You correctly mentioned that there is a need to sort of bridge this gap by India asserting itself in some ways in that sort of space in the Western Indian Ocean region. How does India go about do that? One, you did mention the lack of you know, the material, as it were, which is the submarines, as you correctly pointed out. Who are some of the natural partners that India has in the region? Because you know, there is Gwadar, there is CPEC, there is Russian involvement, there is a Chinese involvement. It's not as if, and the Americans are withdrawing. So India is a natural sort of power there. Who else can be India's partners?
So I think, you know, if you look at the Western Indo-Pacific, I think, you know, we see that India is deepening its maritime relations, its sort of naval to naval cooperation with the Gulf states.
Yeah.
Oman is clearly, the Sultanate of Oman is clearly a favored defense partner for India. The United Arab Emirates, also the Emirati Navy and the Indian Navy have been carrying out exercises, the Saudis. So I think the Gulf is there. But also I think if you look at Eastern Africa region, so I think the first part is to deepen the security relationships with the littoral states.
Correct.
The second part is to deepen security relations with the extra regional powers coming in to the Western Indo-Pacific. So we have, of course, the US, we have the UK, the Royal Navy. France doesn't consider itself an extra regional player, so of course deepen relations with France. So that again is another element of it. But the third, I think, would be an important focus on maritime domain awareness. In the end, maritime domain awareness is the intelligence that the Indian Navy can provide and share with others by getting a fairly comprehensive and detailed picture of what is happening in the Western Indian Indo-Pacific region. India has supported coastal radar stations to different countries on its own coast as well. It is sort of looking at converging interests of there's the Indian Ocean sort of fusion sort of group to look at the maritime domain of Venice picture. The point is that if you have an idea of what is happening in your part of the region, you have a very good chance of being ahead of the curve in trying to mitigate some of the challenges and threats. So that's another aspect. And the final point I would add is that there needs to be some imaginative thinking in this respect, and unfortunately there hasn't been. And let me just give you one or two quick examples. One is that in the Sultanate of Oman there is a new port called Duqm. It's been there for some time, to be fair. This is used by a number of navies, especially the US Navy, the Royal Navy and the Indian Navy. We should think imaginatively. How can the three navies work together in relation to Duqm to ensure that they're able to provide greater support and security to countries of the Gulf region and beyond? Another issue is trilateral naval exercises with some of the navies from outside. India has carried out some of these with other countries, but there needs to be new sort of modes of working through this. Because in the end, the bottom line is that India does seek to be a provider of net security to the Indian Ocean island states. But this is quite an ambitious task, and India knows that it's not able to do it by itself, which is why you won't hear the term net provider of security or provider of net security anymore officially, because that term is now changed to a term called preferred security partnerships, on the basis that India cannot do it alone. So my argument is that India should identify areas where it can take the lead, to identify key partners where it can work together, and I think thirdly, ensure that there is a greater sharing of information and intelligence on the maritime domain. That is key.
This is interesting. You mentioned net security provider. Now, I mean, in my understanding, when you talk about net security provision, you're talking about, say, exercises, joint exercises, you're talking about military assistance, you're talking about port calls and things of that kind, intelligence sharing perhaps. So have I understood that correctly also for our viewers? And more importantly, in the Western Indian Ocean region, what are some of the things that India is doing at this point of time in the context of as a net security provider, and what are some of the things that India should be doing in your opinion? And I sort of, with that, I want while you answer that, if you could also touch upon the new quad that we've been talking about in that region, India, United States, UAE and Israel. Can that play a role in the sort of increasing or enhancing India's maritime presence in the Western Indian Ocean region? I know it's too many questions, but
no, thank you. I mean, I've always had a problem with this concept of net security provider,
right,
because net security provider, is implied to mean that India is going to sort of provide the additional security to the country. It's a huge concept. It's an ambitious task.
Right.
Net provider of security, on the other hand, is a much more limited way, where you're saying you're providing a net amount, not for the whole security aspect, which is the earlier term. So I think there's been a miscommunication earlier, and this has took place in fact during the Congress government, and they continued during this current government. But I think the Navy was always wise and always preferred to use the term net provider of security. But at the end of last year, even this term was seen to be quite ambitious, and the Navy frankly did not have the financial resources or the capacity to do this, because net provider of security also essentially implies you're doing it yourself.
Right.
It is the Indian Navy doing it with Mauritius, with Seychelles, etc. And I think there's a greater realization that this can't be done by itself, by the Indian Navy alone. So you have other countries coming in, which is why you have the term preferred security partnership. So in terms of net provider of security or preferred security partnership now, I mean, I think what is important is there are three things that are key. One is the Navy to Navy relationships, which is exercises with countries. Now remember, they'll have smaller navies, so you've got to be, you've got to modify your own capacity for that.
Right.
But the second would be deeper security partnerships. And deeper security partnerships would be in terms of intelligence sharing, provision of facilities, for example, logistic support, within these countries for the Indian Navy, specialized training in that sense. So again, a strong security dimension. And the third part would be supplying equipment, arms, navy ships, and that's a new aspect that has now really taken hold. About 2 years ago, there was an ambitious program. I think the Indian Defence Minister was keen to be seen as exporting arms to Indian Ocean island states and littoral countries.
Right.
I mean, that has started. But it's going to take a long time, because it's not just a provision of helicopters or patrol boats, but spares, trading, etc. So it is in these three areas that India is seeking to have preferred security partnerships. But what is important also is a shared aspect in terms of maritime domain awareness on maritime surveillance. Now, for example, India does a lot of the maritime surveillance for Mauritius, for the Seychelles, who don't have the capacity. So this again helps in mapping out the Indian Ocean areas. So there are multiple ways that this can work, but it needs the support and participation of smaller countries. And so far, that has been successful. But as I said, I think there's been a sort of a change in emphasis today in terms of getting other countries involved in these relationships.
And the Quad question.
The Quad. So I think that's a good question. I mean, there is some favoritism towards minilaterals. Setting up rather than multilaterals. What works well. So I think you have the Quad to the east, which is of course India, Japan, Australia, and the US, and you have the Quad to the west. I'm sort of a bit skeptical of the Quad to the west. I think remember the relations between Israel and the UAE have only recently taken off because of the Abraham Accords and the implementation there. But it's still early days. Now, if there are concerns between and among some of the Quad countries, or say of the Western Quad, we're not going to see a successful and a great implementation of the Quad to the west. So I would just just say, well, let's see how it operates politically first. I mean, as far as I'm aware, there still hasn't been any face-to-face meeting. There's been no summit. So I think let's see how that operates first at a political level, and then we can look at whether there will be an economic dimension clearly, but whether there'll be a security dimension, we'll have to see, because in the Quad to the east again, though it used to be called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, but only recently now has changed its name to the Quadrilateral Dialogue. The emphasis for all four countries of the Eastern Quad, it is not security related.
Right.
Exactly. So we'll have to see what happens to the Quad to the west.
Exactly. I want to bring in the U.S. question in this regard. I mean, there is of course the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and there is it is only reasonable to assume that the American interest in the Middle East / West Asian region is going to decrease, given the fact that they're not going to have any dependence as far as the region is concerned for its energy supplies from the West Asian region. So if the American interest in the region reduces and the focus actually shifts to the Eastern Indian Indo-Pacific, as it were, and India still has major security interests or strategic interests in the Western Indian Ocean region. So who are some of the other partners? You mentioned the East African countries or some of the littoral states in the region. Is the United Kingdom, you sit in London, you work in London. What's the sense that you are getting in London about the UK's interest in the Western Indian Ocean region, as it were?
So I think there has been again a huge change in UK thinking towards the Indo-Pacific and to India, and I believe this has taken place because of two reasons. First is a post-Brexit agenda. So clearly, the UK sort of came out of the European Union and was looking, for a more active foreign and security policy role. Secondly, was the China factor, where there's been again a change in the UK's thinking towards China, even as recently when as the integrated review, where I think it was sort of there was sort of mixed sort of perceptions on China, We had, in fact, my institution, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, hosted the first public talk by the chief of the UK's external intelligence agencies, the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. And in that talk, which is freely available on the net, he clearly said that China is the top concern for the UK. So there's been a shift and a change, I would argue, in the UK's thinking towards China, which I think for these two reasons, post-Brexit and the change in UK thinking, provides opportunities for India and the UK to deepen and expand their defense and security cooperation. And maritime security, cyber security are key elements of this. But on maritime security, I would strongly argue that there are 3 or 4 ways that this could work. The first is really to work more closely in the Gulf region. I mentioned Dukum earlier, and I think that we need to see much more sort of jointness and joint activities between the Royal Navy and the Indian Navy and perhaps the Third Navy. The second, I think, is that with the exception of the recent exercise when the Queen Elizabeth carrier came to the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, India-UK naval exercises have been largely limited to 1 ship each or 2 ships each. Now this has to expand. We have got to look at more trilateral sort of exercises, but the exercises themselves have to become larger and more focused and more complex. And the third area, I think, is really for India and the UK to work together on maritime domain awareness issues, to look at the assets they have in the Indian Ocean to get a better picture. And that brings up the issue of Diego Garcia, the British Indian Ocean Territory, which is controversial politically in that sense. But I think that we need to have a relook at how there can be some beneficial benefits to both India and the UK in terms of the access and the sort of range and the location of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. So there are ways, imaginative ways to work on this. Also to work on the Indian Ocean Rim Association, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, again, where India and the UK can work together. So there are areas, but these have to be identified and implemented.
You spoke at length about India's interest in the Western Indo-Pacific. Now, could you also tell us what you think are some of UK's interests in that particular space? I mean, it used to be, of course, the Royal Navy in the region, and but that was a very long time ago. Today, 2022, what are some of UK's key strategic priorities or interests in the Western Indo-Pacific, as it were?
So I think there are 2 interests really. The first is the UK's post-Brexit new foreign policy role. And I mean, it's put across rhetorically as global Britain. I mean, it may not really match that sort of the global aspect of it, but what it does indicate, and I've seen it, there is not only keenness, but there's a lot of emphasis in ensuring that the UK is able, now that it's out of the European Union, to have its own independent foreign and security policy in large parts of the world. So this is quite different from the UK as part of the EU, where the UK is flying its own flag and it is looking at seeking security relationships with countries in the Indian Ocean, in the Western Indo-Pacific particularly. The second is on trade issues. I mean, trade is a key aspect for the UK post-Brexit. India and the UK are likely to sign an interim trade agreement shortly. The UK has been signing trade agreements with Australia, Japan, etc. So trade interests, where the Western Indo-Pacific are there, a strong trade interests focus away from where the EU dominated on the balance of trade with the UK to a more global and a larger focus of trade on the Western Indo-Pacific region. So I would say trade and security are the 2 pillars of the UK's interest in this region.
Dr. Roy-Chaudhury, you wrote an article in The Wire last year, and you wrote that the UK's new foreign and security policy tilt towards the Indo-Pacific remains fully anchored within the Euro-Atlantic region, with the US as its most important strategic ally and Russia as its most acute threat. So how meaningful from what you just said, it appears that UK does certainly have significant interest in the Western Indo-Pacific region. But from what you wrote in the Wire last year, it appears that the priorities or the worldview about the Indo-Pacific region is pretty much geared towards the Eastern Indo-Pacific region, or am I getting it wrong?
No, Dr. Happymon Jacob. I mean, so I think you're right. I mean, I don't think we can take the UK away from the focus and the relationship it has with the UK, with the US. Sorry, I think that is strong, and in fact that's become stronger with the war in Ukraine. With Russia, again, Russia was clearly identified as the main threat to the UK in the integrated review that came out recently. So, in a way, again, what we're seeing in the Ukraine war really sort of just builds on that, as Russia being a key threat. So, I think the Indo-Pacific is now a priority for the UK. But I'm not saying that, we've talked about tilt to the Indo-Pacific, the UK's tilt to the Indo-Pacific. We're not talking about a pivot to the Indo-Pacific,
Right.
Where the UK is sort of pivoting
Right.
fully.
Right.
I think that's the difference.
That's right.
It's labeled a tilt in the document also, not a pivot. And I think as long as we're clear that that is not likely to change. But remember, if you look towards the next 10 years, the UK's interests, or whether on trade issues, on defense and security ties, are going to increase in the Indo-Pacific, in the Eastern Indo-Pacific region and also the Western Indo-Pacific region. More, I think, than in terms of the focus on Russia, arguably, and though the relationship with the US will remain. So, if we're looking at the future, I think the tilt is going to, there'll be an increased tilt towards the Indo-Pacific, but not a pivot, no.
Let me put it this way. Where are the UK-India defense relationship headed? Are there some cracks between the two sides in terms of the defense partnership that needs to be fixed before greater involvement by India and UK in a joint manner in the Western Indian Ocean region? Or do you think that things are not all that bad? Or are there cracks? What's your sense?
No, I think to be honest, I think there are cracks. Defense and security have been correctly identified as one of the 5 key pillars of the India-UK Roadmap 2030, which is an unprecedented document. I mean, the first time any two countries are really saying to each other that we have a 10-year program of action and activities with each other. I mean, unprecedented document, first for both countries, the UK and India, to sign up on this 10-year roadmap. Within the roadmap, there are 5 pillars. Defense and security is one of the key pillars. Now, there is a lot of ambition to move forward on the defense and security pillar, but there is also, I would say honestly, a degree of mistrust between the two countries on this issue. And the mistrust stems partly from legacy defense issues, where there have been some problems over the provision of supplies and the supply chains for equipment provided by the UK, but also at a larger political level in relation to what you had mentioned earlier, Afghanistan and also Pakistan, and also there is Indian concern over some activities within the UK. So, I think mistrust in the defense security relationship, and this needs to be overcome. So that's very important, because unless you overcome it, you're not able to move forward. But there are now new opportunities that are taking place. I mean, I think the Ukraine war provides UK PLC, the British companies, to see what how they can work with India, as the British Foreign Secretary Elizabeth Truss, who's in Delhi today, has told the Foreign Affairs Committee of Parliament in the UK a few days ago that it is in UK's interest to work with India to provide it alternatives to Russia's supply of arms and weapons to India. So this is one way where UK PLC will have to identify the equipment that it can supply as an alternative to Russia. But also another way, I think, is in terms of the importance for India of co-creation, co-development of technology. There are problems over sharing of intellectual property rights and sharing of technology. But I think again, we need imaginative solutions to this. It's very clear that since the Ukraine war, the Indian government's position has hardened in terms of Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliance in defense, and UK companies would now need to sort of look at, hopefully, at being able to effectively transfer technology in a safe and secure manner. The third area, I would say, on maritime security issues would be underwater technology, where the UK has tremendous qualitative advantages, whether it's underwater autonomous vehicles, etc., etc. These are again areas of strength. So I would see that there are now new opportunities that have emerged, and I think if the UK and India are able to work together to look at some of the new opportunities and seek to overcome some of the legacy problems, that is the way forward to building trust and a deeper and a more focused and a qualitative defense and security partnership between the two countries.
Interesting you put it that way. That's a very encouraging and let's say a positive way of looking at it. Because I was under the impression that given the Western focus and the American focus on Ukraine now, on Russia now, there is perhaps going to be there's perhaps going to be limited focus and enthusiasm for Quad or Indo-Pacific and this region in general. And I think there are worries in Delhi. You are in Delhi today and you've been speaking to people. I think there are genuine concerns that what's happening in Ukraine and Russia may actually take the focus off the region. So do you really see that happening, or you don't think that happening in the longer term?
I think that in the immediate and short term, there is overwhelming UK focus on Ukraine.
That's right.
I mean, for the UK, Ukraine is an existential threat in terms of the change to the security architecture of Europe, and also sort of a clash between democracy and autocracy. So in the last near 20 years I've spent in the UK, I've never seen sort of foreign war have such an impact domestically in the UK than the Ukraine war. So clearly in the immediate and the near term, Ukraine will continue to dominate. There will also be global implications for countries, including India, in terms of supply chains, in terms of rising fuel costs, food grain costs, etc. But I would say, that in the medium term, in the next 3 to 4 years, I think the importance of the Indo-Pacific will come back. China will be strengthened in terms of, and is being strengthened in terms of the relationship with Russia, where China is now clearly the senior partner for Russia. Different countries will learn different lessons from the Ukraine war, and that may itself be a problem. But I would say, with the exception of the immediate and the near term, the focus on the Indo-Pacific, on China, the Quad will continue, because that is where the engines of economic growth are. I mean, that is where the next 5 to 10 years the future is. And we've tilted a bit back to Europe, I think, but the tilt will sort of reverse itself shortly.
Fascinating insights. Thank you so much for joining on this show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a privilege. Thank you.
Get a sneak peek of exclusive content before everyone else, for channel members only. Memberships start at ₹89. Hit the join button below.